Atheist Nomads, episode 436, Liberation Theology.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin, and joining me is Lauren.
Hello.
And this week, before we get into the main topic, there is a big sale going on at the store.
Ooh.
So we're announcing the dates of the 10th through 17th with $14 t-shirts and everything else up to 30% off.
Nice.
What I'm not going to tell you is what happens if you show up on a date outside of that range in the near future. Wink, wink.
Okay, so there is a sale going on.
But I'm just advertising the 10th through 17th.
Oh, okay. This is like a little nod, wink, wink thing from the...
Nod, wink, wink. On date of release, you could probably find the same deal.
Seems like they have it about every other week.
And this month is almost the entire month.
Okay, well, there we go.
Yeah. And I did a couple bug fixes with the production stuff. The first one is really embarrassing.
Okay. Dish.
When I switched last year from Ardor to Reaper, oh no, it was even before that. This is a couple years back. I wrote a script that handled cutting the silences short. And one thing I definitely found was when it's me solo, it doesn't quite sound natural. When it's a group discussion and the more people involved, the more natural it sounds.
Okay.
And I finally found the setting that I was missing.
Oh.
And I added it in. And so now, and if you downloaded the episode a day late last week, then you got the updated audio. Otherwise, this week will be your first one with the new silence truncation, where if it's longer than a second, it won't cut it to 0. It'll cut it to 3/4 of a second.
Okay.
And that will be much better.
Much more natural.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than this weird no pause.
Yeah.
Ramble on that so many podcasters actually do.
Where an intentional pause turns into 0 pause. Yeah.
And you do a lot of pauses in your talk.
Which is one reason why I have to do automation on it.
Right.
And then on the newsletter, which, yes, we have a newsletter.
Aw, that's so old school.
You can find it at
atheistnomads. Do we have a Yahoo forum as well?
No.
Oh.
No. atheistnomads.com/newsletter. You can sign up. Well, I created a new newsletter last year, and then I updated the subscribe page on the website, and then didn't finish setting up the newsletter, so about 20 people signed up for the new newsletter with nothing being sent to it.
Okay.
While the people signed up for the old newsletter were continuing to get it. And then I discovered that glaring mistake that I hadn't figured out, and I merged the two into the newsletter, and I actually got it set up and working, except the unsubscribe link wasn't working.
Which would be really annoying if you signed up for a newsletter a while ago, never got anything, forgot about it, and all of a sudden it starts showing up.
Especially the test email I sent that said, and if you don't still want this, just click the unsubscribe link down below. There wasn't
it didn't
one.
Work. Oh, okay.
What had happened there was I was a little over aggressive on turning off tracking in the newsletter, and that meant that the service can't track unsubscribes. They don't have permission to track that. So I have turned that one on. The newsletter still won't track whether or not you read it or what you click on, but it will at least track you clicking the unsubscribe link so it can actually unsubscribe you.
That's good. I love that. Well, you went a little too far there.
I went too far. Yep. That is a time where tracking is good.
Yep.
So now for the topic.
The topic at hand.
Liberation Theology.
Okay.
This is something that I've wanted to talk about on the podcast for probably 5 or 6 years.
Be prepared for some questions because I know nothing about it.
I just never got around to it. It's one of those where it's like, I have a vague concept, but I don't know enough about it to wing it. And something more compelling kept coming up. But after talking about prosperity gospel, I absolutely had to talk about liberation theology. And prosperity gospel / prosperity theology and liberation theology There is a way of looking at it that they're just two sides of the same coin, and that is flat out wrong.
And that's just wrong.
And I have discovered in my reading that it is absolutely wrong. They are polar opposites.
Oh, okay.
But one did set up people for the other.
So hence the connection with prosperity gospel.
There is a connection. Similar to how the anti-vax movement of, 3 years ago was the antithesis of the everybody must be carrying guns at all times movement. And now they're one and the same.
Ugh, yeah.
Yeah, similar to that.
I feel bad for the people who are on either side of that who aren't the other. But they're all getting balled it together anyway because, yeah.
When you get far enough onto an extreme, it is very easy.
You get clumped in with all the extremes.
It turns out the spectrum is a circle.
Typically, that's how spectrums are.
And when it comes to politics and religion, by the time you get to the extreme ends of the spectrum, usually you've gone full circle.
You're right back around to the other side.
Yeah. So liberation theology, to get to some history on this, we need to start. We can go all the way back to the Punic Wars and Rome defeating Hannibal and conquering the Iberian Peninsula.
Nice.
Which resulted in the...
Sounds punitive. Or was that punitive?
which resulted...
I made a pun. That was funny.
Which resulted in the Romanization of the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay.
So taking Celtic people, which Celtic in modern usage of modern peoples refers to the Irish and a handful of other populations. In that time period, it meant everybody who wasn't Roman or Greek that was around the Mediterranean or Central Europe. They became Roman, and so we know there were Christians in the Iberian Peninsula by the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. Because
this is Spain and Portugal, right?
Spain and Portugal, yes.
Thank you. Just
modern day Spain and Portugal. Because Paul talks about visiting them in his letters. So we know that there were Christians there very, very early. There was a very large Jewish population very early in Spain and modern day Spain and Portugal. Well, after Rome fell, the Germanic tribes came in, which were the not Roman and Greek people who weren't Celtic.
Okay.
That's really all that meant. And
yeah, but you just said the Celtic was everybody. So who are
those were the people who weren't them.
Okay.
Who were noticeably more barbarian than the Celts.
Okay.
This is waves of barbarians is really what we're talking about.
Okay.
So when Rome fell, the Germanic tribes conquered all of the Western Roman lands, including modern day Spain and Portugal. And they got to hold on to that for a whole 200 years before the Moors came, which were North African Muslim converts who, after being converted at the sword by Arabs, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and conquered the Iberian Peninsula and almost defeated France.
Oh, wow.
The Battle of Tours, the Moors almost defeated the French army, and if they had, they would have taken over about half of France. And the 100 Years' War would have been Normans versus Muslims.
Oh, cool.
It would have been a crazy, totally alternate history. That didn't happen. Was this
discussed on the Alternate History podcast?
That version wasn't, and it's a YouTube channel. And no, that wasn't, that particular angle, the 100 Years' War did come up. But anyway, so then the Reconquista began. The descendants of the Germanic barbarian rulers over
As a D&D player, this just fills me with glee.
Over the Latinized Celts of Spain started the holy quest of trying to reconquer their lands.
Okay.
That was a quest
that can't end well.
That they didn't make much progress until the main crusades that are talked about ended and the other crusades started. Those crusades started because, the crusades started in the first place because the Pope couldn't have Christian kings and princes fighting against each other all the time when there are Muslims in Spain?
How dare they?
Like, seriously, the risk of that resulting in a civil war in France leading to Muslims conquering Germany was a real risk. And also around that time, Muslims had also conquered southern Italy. So really what the Pope was afraid of was Muslims conquering Rome.
Okay.
Which was a serious,
so they're
serious
like, stop fighting amongst yourselves. Let's go look at this. Go fight this guy.
Go kill Muslims.
Okay.
Go to their land and kill them so they don't kill us here. Once those were done, there were a whole bunch of knights who knew how to fight. And what happens when you bring home a bunch of veterans? You got to keep them busy.
They start fighting each other.
And so you had the Eastern Crusades, which was to go Christianize the Slavs, and the Reconquista, which were really the Southwestern Crusades or the Western Crusades. And the Reconquista basically, for the most part, was 13 and 1400s, culminating in 1492, when Granada was finally retaken by the Crown of Castile. There was no Spain at that time. There was Castile and Aragon kingdoms, and a handful of other kingdoms. The King of Castile was approached by an Italian by the name of Christopher Columbus, and that's why Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He just finished conquering. He led a warrior class of warriors who needed to fight holy wars. And so the goal was to have Columbus go find places to go send his soldiers to go fight holy wars.
Well, that worked out really peachy, didn't it?
And Columbus found the Caribbean and South America and
the rape of
and Crusaders.
North and South Central America began.
Yeah, and then Crusaders landed in the Americas. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was...
Yeah, that whole myth about Columbus exploring, that's just... He was, but...
He was, because he thought that in a way you could say he was the anti-germ theory person of his day. He thought that the experts and the scientists of the last, almost 2,000 years were wrong in their calculation of the diameter of the Earth.
You're right.
And that it was actually only a quarter as big around. So...
Well, we're always fed it was just for the spices. He was just going for spices.
He was.
Right, but the Spanish did not give him money just to go find spices.
Columbus wanted to find spices and become rich.
Right.
Spain wanted to find spices to send soldiers to take the spices.
Yes.
That's
the part that they don't teach.
Yeah. And he instead found this entire continent where Spain could send lots of soldiers to go fight holy wars elsewhere against the Aztec and the Inca and the Maya and...
Everybody.
But these were holy wars. They weren't just fighting for king, they were fighting for God and king. In the El Camino Real, the King's Highway, you could reasonably argue that that's God's highway, not the highway of the King of Spain.
Oh, you mean the translation is...
That the translation that the king is... It can be argued reasonably that is an ambiguous translation.
King with a capital K?
And the soldiers that went were crusaders. They took priests with them. And the goal was to not just conquer, but convert. Like, that was inherently a part of the plan of the conquest of the Americas, was conquer and convert.
Yeah.
Part of the goal there is by converting, you can subjugate more easily than if you just conquer. That's also something that they did when they retook the Iberian Peninsula, since most of the general population had converted to Islam by that time. And that's part of why the Spanish Inquisition drove out most of the remaining Muslims and Jews, because they hadn't converted to Christianity, despite all the threats. So that's how the Spanish Empire worked. As the empire was as much a political as a religious institution. At the center of every colonial city was a government building and a cathedral or other church building, and that formed the central square.
Yeah.
And that was how it worked. You had the state on one side and the church on the other, and both had a lot of control, and the church had a lot of land. Like at the time of the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and the Mexican government seized all church lands, the church owned something like 30% of all of Mexico.
Jeez. You had to be seizing that shit too.
Yeah. So when the Age of Revolutions happened, the original revolutions in the Spanish and Portuguese empires, where the colonies broke free, nothing really changed. Like, when you look at California and the story of Zorro, there's some versions of it where he's trying to help fight for independence against the king, and others, he's trying to fight for independence against Mexico. And there were Mexicans in California who were in favor of the Republic of California being a thing.
Yeah.
And even some thinking that the U.S. might be better than Mexico for them. Because what happened when Spain and Portugal got kicked out was the white people still had all of the power and money and control and ran the government. It was just the white people born there as opposed to the white people born back in Europe. So nothing really changed until the 20th century. And in the early 20th century, the Catholic Action Movement started in mostly Peru and other parts of South America. This was most notable with Holguin of Arequipa and Farfán of Cusco. These were two priests who started trying to get the church to do what
I'm sorry, could you say their names again? Just their names.
Holguin
and
Farfán.
That's just...
Yeah.
I love those names.
Their goal...
Farfán.
Their goal was to try to separate church and state, at least a little bit, and not separate church and state in the way we think in the U.S. This was to get the church out from underneath the state's thumb.
Oh, okay.
We're afraid of the church taking over the state. They're trying to get the church away from the state so that it can exert political influence.
Yikes.
Because it can't if the state controls it.
Right.
And they also started actually politically advocating for the poor, because one thing that had never happened in Latin America up to that point was anybody giving a shit about the poor.
Well, it's just funny, because isn't that like a Catholic mainstay?
It wasn't then.
Ah.
At that time, the Catholic Church was,
all about enriching itself.
It was the spiritual princes who worked with the temporal princes.
With lots of money exchanged.
So one of the things that they established were base ecumenical communities. These were often villages, but were sometimes neighborhoods and towns. And as South America started to industrialize in big cities, where there would be usually lay people, sometimes a priest would be involved, taking care of each other, forming groups of 20 to 50 people who, as time went on, would provide medical care. Okay, really crappy, shitty, low quality. We should probably call it first aid, but they'd provide aid. They would help people with, if one family was out of food, everybody else would pool a little bit of food for that one family. And they would start working on getting electricity for the rest of the community. Well, for their pod.
Right.
And these communities started the process of giving poor people something. And when you give poor people something, they want more.
Yeah.
Well, one of those...
Understandably.
Yes, because they need more. A lot more.
They need more.
Yeah. One of these poor people was Gustavo Gutiérrez, who was of partial Qetchua ancestry, the Qetchua being one of the main native tribes of Peru and one of the main constituent tribes of the Inca Empire.
Okay, cool. We never hear about those guys.
Because of his Qetchua ancestry and how that just worked in the social structure, he was very, very low and very poor and impoverished, and had no real chances to advance himself. except for through the church. And he did. He became a priest. He went through the seminary, and he was sent to Belgium to study more. And when he got to Belgium, he got to see that the whole world, including heavily Catholic areas, are not like they were back in Peru, where poor people are taken care of, where there are social safety nets. And
he's like, wait, you guys are messed up. I bet that's how people feel when they see the U.S. healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, dude, you guys are messed up here.
Absolutely. He went back to South America, and he got involved with the Latin American Episcopal Council. Well, okay, he didn't actually get involved with the council. He wasn't high enough ranking yet. He had to work some lower jobs. But the Latin American Episcopal Council, which was not part of the Episcopal Church, it was part of the Catholic Church.
Okay, I hate it when they do that. Ugh. Use one word and just don't mess with it.
Yeah. And well, the Catholic Church is the, Holy Catholic Orthodox Church, if you really get particular.
Well,
even though it's not Orthodox. And the Orthodox Church is, they're all under the Ecumenical Patriarch, who's the head of the Holy Catholic Orthodox Church. And
it's complicated for on purpose.
Latin American Episcopal Council means the council of the top guys in the Catholic Church in Latin America.
Okay.
They try to get all the Latin American bishops together. And they pushed for progressive reforms in the Vatican II conference, which ran from 1962 to 1965. Part of this was fueled by the 1959 Cuban Revolution, where they saw communism being able to take hold in a Catholic, Spanish-speaking Latin American country, and that people could get improvements. And so they wanted some of that for their people.
Makes sense.
They didn't get much of what they asked for out of Vatican
They
II.
didn't get squat, but they tried.
So then they had the Medellin Conference in Colombia in 1968. And their primary goal was to support the basic ecumenical communities. They didn't get it out of the Vatican, but they wanted to still keep pushing and supporting and trying to continue to advance the basic ecumenical communities to try and get more electricity to people and maybe get things like sanitation and water and
something beyond first aid.
Something a little better than first aid. Yeah. And this was where Gutierrez shows up. It's debatable as to whether or not he was invited, but he was there, and he gave a talk where he first introduced Liberation Theology. 3 years later, in 1971, he published his book.
I'm sorry, it blows my mind that this all happened in the 60s.
This is the 60s and 70s. Yeah.
Like, I was thinking 1860s and 70s.
Nope.
Like 1960s and 70s. Okay, this is very new.
We're talking about Latin America, where, when you look at the Latin American governments that were set up after they got independence, they almost all copied the same model as the U.S. How the U.S. government didn't get overthrown by a military dictatorship is actually the remarkable thing.
We're just a freak of nature.
And if you really want to look at why,
and close.
It's because Washington dismissed the army.
Mm.
If he had kept, and it's probably his true genius, was he dismissed the standing army and warned against having a standing army. He said it's because if you have one, it will just encourage you to go into more wars. I think in all practicality, his fear was if you have one, they will take over.
Yeah.
As happened over and over again throughout Latin America. Yeah, 1971, Gutierrez published A Theology of Liberation.
Okay.
It was his magnum opus. It was a full book, fully fleshing out the concept of liberation theology.
So what the hell is it?
It is a 3-level plan.
God, it sounds like a pyramid scheme.
The first level is the poor liberate themselves from economic exploitation. That's the first step in liberation.
Okay.
The second level is liberation from fatalism. In other words, you were born poor, therefore you will be poor and your children will be poor because you're basically stuck in a caste of poor people. And recognition of free will, which is basically just that even if you were born in a poor family, you can improve yourself.
Okay.
Not free will in terms of you are a free moral agent, just in you can actually better yourself as a person. And the third level is profit. No, it's actually communion with God.
Okay.
It's once you free yourself from poverty.
You got me there for that was so.
Once you free yourself from poverty and you recognize that you are in control of your destiny, only then can you truly have communion with God. This spawned the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua in 1978 that led to a full-on socialist, communist rule of Nicaragua until 1990, when they were finally overthrown.
Wow.
That revolution was against a very oppressive dictator, and the Sandistas took over, and they put in a lot of work into improving access to healthcare and education, and trying to improve literacy rates, and also murdered a lot of people, and were overthrown because they were a murderous, rampaging, but raising up the poor communist government, because that tends to be what happens with communism, is you raise up the poor that you don't kill.
You mean that's what tends to happen with organized government? Because it doesn't matter which label you put on it, communist or not. No, that happens. You have militarized people in charge.
Anytime you have an all-powerful government that got there with guns, they will use the guns against anybody who doesn't agree with them.
Yeah.
And by this time, actually, almost immediately after the Sandistas took over Nicaragua, the conservative opposition really got some high-up support. And I want to be clear, up to this point, we have only talked about brown-skinned, at least pretty heavily indigenous ancestry people from Latin America.
Yeah.
Now the white people show up.
And that's when the party really starts to take off, huh?
So unlike Africa, where the story was kind of the opposite. Well, okay, now we have talked about a lot of white people with the early days, but this movement so far has been a native-born movement, where what we saw with Africa is white people import a movement, and then the natives take it over and
glorified it,
and it explodes once it's under native control. And in South America, this was a native-born movement that was exploding through the under levels of society, through the poor people. And John Paul II, as Pope, attended the Puebla Conference in 1979 and said, quote, "The idea of Christ as a political figure, a revolutionary, as a subversive of Nazareth does not tally with the church's catechesis." But he did acknowledge some benefits of liberation theology, saying, "The growing wealth of a few parallels the growing poverty of the masses." And he also went on to affirm private property as a principle, which a lot of the liberation theology people were starting to oppose the concept of private property, since
that's what kept them underfoot.
Very, very few people owned all the property.
Yeah.
And for, the majority.
So it sounds like the Catholics are kind of a mixed bag.
Well, in this case, we're talking about, just by the Catholics, we're talking about the people there, plus their European overlords.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, it was a mixed bag. So yeah, he
right there, all Catholic.
And then John Paul II also said, quote, or that the church, quote, "must preach, educate individuals and collectivities, form public opinion, and offer orientations to the leaders of the peoples, with the goal being, quote, more just and equitable distribution of goods."
Okay.
So on one side, he said, no revolution. And on the other side, he said, we really need to make things a little bit better for the poor. Part of liberation theology is if you can't get it through peaceful means, revolution is an option.
Yeah.
The Sandistas took it to revolution.
Yeah.
Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, who is not a Sith Lord despite his appearance. He was at the time the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And in the 1980s, he wrote about liberation theology a lot, saying, quote, and in his best, most illustrative version of what he said about it, to really sum up his opinions, he wrote, quote, the deviations and risk of deviation damaging to the faith brought about by certain forms of liberation theology which use in an insufficiently critical manner concepts borrowed from various currents of Marxist thought.
So he said liberation theology is too communist?
He said it is communist.
Yeah.
It was, really.
How else are you going to get poor people out of the gutter?
It was a principle of the classes must struggle because they lived in a society where the classes were very firm and it required struggle. And so the lower classes must struggle against the higher classes.
Yeah, because the higher classes are struggling so hard.
Because the higher classes have all of the money and all of the land, and the lower classes have nothing. So, yes, of course it's going to use Marxist language. Latin America at the time was just barely starting to industrialize. Marx was speaking to a Germany that was just beginning to industrialize.
Yeah. He was speaking to people in the same situation. So, of course, it was going to ring.
And just like how Leninism and Stalinism were both different from Marxism, and Maoism was even more different, liberation theology drew off of Marxism, but was not Marxism.
Yeah. But it was close enough that it made many people very uncomfortable.
But it was close enough to make conservatives very uncomfortable. So the church then, of course, under Ratzinger's guidance as head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, who got to write lots and lots of stuff about faith, including the Catechism of the Church.
Right.
They went through pushing the church to be more spiritual and less focused on the material world, and argued that liberation theology was too material. Now, at the time that liberation theology was first being articulated, the Catholic Church was just as material.
Yeah, it was the most material.
Uh-huh.
It was rich as hell.
And so they didn't get rid of any of the gold, but they did try to repaint things in more spiritual terms, and even argued that liberation theology was trying to divorce Catholicism from the afterlife. It wasn't. That was the third step.
Was communing with the afterlife, with God, to ensure your afterlife. So it just sounded like they just started throwing crap at the walls to see what would stick.
Oh, yeah. Then they announced reconciliation theology, which argued that by reconciling with God and others, class struggle and revolution can be avoided. If you reconcile with your landlord, you don't have to kill your landlord so you can actually own the place you live in.
Right.
If you reconcile with the factory owner, then the union doesn't need to take down management.
Yeah, that's the definition of reconciliation. That's true. But reconciliation often leads to the poor getting the shaft.
Yep.
Over and over and over again.
Yep.
So, status quo, I guess.
Yep.
And if I'm figuring this out, they figured this out.
Absolutely.
If I'm able to put two and two together, then yeah.
After a good 10 years of the Catholic Church seriously, the highest levels of the Catholic Church seriously arguing against liberation theology, and governments in Latin America, outside of Nicaragua, where liberation theology took over, they were all actively opposing it as well. Once communism fell, there wasn't really any inspiration or any financial support for any movements. The Sandistas would not have happened without the Soviet Union funding them.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And giving them guns. revolution was funded by the commies.
Yeah. Still is.
And by the mid-1990s, the movement had died.
Okay.
Since then, there has been a crazy rise in Pentecostalism across Latin America. Like, we're talking 20-30% of the population in a lot of countries in Latin America becoming Pentecostal.
Barf.
As we learned in our Africa series, that's probably mostly prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
Which speaks to the same issues. You're poor. You can't have a good relationship with God if you're too poor. That's sinful. You need to do better and give us money.
God, it just drives me crazy.
And in a way, Liberation Theology and its collapse set up the area perfectly for prosperity gospel to come in
Power vacuum.
and take over.
Yeah.
Power vacuum among the powerless.
Yeah. Aw.
To extract as much wealth out of the poor as they can.
And it works. Ugh.
So, in conclusion, considering how liberation theology is inherently opposed to the stability of the status quo in favor of oppressed peoples, it's no wonder that it's universally opposed by the church organizations, most notably the Vatican. And it's also worth considering that perhaps it's not the theology that's the important part of liberation theology, which the church also figured out.
Yeah.
Higher education is hard to come by for oppressed peoples. Whether it's somebody of Qetchua ancestry in Peru, or a black man in the US in the 1930s, or a black man in apartheid South Africa, education's hard to come by. Or a woman, period. It's hard to come by.
Lady bits.
Education's hard to come by. Unless you choose the one course of study that's the least threatening to those in power. That's studying to be a pastor. Because they assume that young pastors will be assimilated into the very churches that are backing their power.
Yeah.
But it's the education itself that opens up the mind and provides the perspective, philosophy, and history to know that a more equitable society is possible.
I mean, in some cases, it gives the opportunity.
A more equitable society is possible. It's hard to get.
Yeah.
And you have to get the people in power to realize that they need to, like, the reason why Europe has such a strong, most European countries have such a strong welfare state, specifically in Western Europe, is because they knew if they didn't, the people would rise up and the Soviet Union would be happy to back them. They had to raise up the poor or they would perish.
Yeah.
In Peru, the risk is low. The risk of ignoring the poor is low, and so they can. But the fact that, it's education is what sparked liberation theology. And the church just happened to provide the opportunity for that education.
That makes sense.
In feedback from Rob Spent 67 on Twitter, good episode.
Yes.
About last week's.
Okay, nice. Short but sweet.
Yep. Rob liked the short and sweet episode. It was rough, and I'm sorry for that. I went with an outline this time as opposed to a script, with the exception of that conclusion. I did script that out.
I could tell from the tone of your voice, and I'm sorry for throwing a wrench in it. I know you wrote that to end the episode, and then I'm like, yeah, well.
That's okay.
Not everybody who goes into theology actually comes out of it a smarter, more liberated person.
Oh, absolutely. Most don't.
But the opportunity, at least, is there.
And like in the U.S., the Clergy Project is in place to try to help the pastors who... It finally clicked a little bit too late.
Yeah.
I'm lucky in that it clicked before I was a pastor. And I was just a seminary student with a ridiculous amount of debt. But that's neither here nor there. If you want to support the show, you can find out how at atheistnomads.com/donate. And if you want to contact us, use the SpeakPipe button on the website or the contact form also on the website, or email us at feedback@atheistnomads.com. And until next week, remember, not all those who wander are lost.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Atheist Nomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.